You stole my storage space. I'm cutting your locks. Ma'am, that's my shed on my property. Not anymore. It belongs to the community. Yeah, that was Karen, bolt cutters in hand, standing over my brand new padlock like she was auditioning for a demolition derby. Smash that like button if you've ever had a neighbor try to enforce rules they just made up. Subscribe for more tales where Karens rewrite reality and lose spectacularly. Because, what she didn't know? By the time we were done, her entire house would be locked down tighter than Fort Knox, permanently. It all began with something as ordinary as a backyard shed. I had spent weeks researching the right model, something sturdy enough to keep my tools safe, big enough for seasonal storage, and stylish enough that it wouldn't make the yard look like a junkyard. When it arrived, I poured a Saturday into setting it up, making sure the foundation was level, every bolt tightened, and the new padlock snapped cleanly into place. To me, it was just a simple project, a quiet win in the long list of home improvements. To Karen, it was apparently a personal insult, carved into the neighborhood skyline. The very first time she saw it, I could tell the shed was about to become ground zero for a new wave of neighborhood drama. She walked across the lawn, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Without even saying hello, she pointed at the shed like it was radioactive and announced that outside storage units were community property. Her words didn't even make sense. Community property? This was my backyard, on my deed, with property lines surveyed and recorded at the county office. Still, she spoke with the kind of unshakable authority only a Karen can muster, as if repeating something loudly enough could make it real. I tried to explain, calmly at first, that the shed was on my lot and that there was nothing in the HOA guidelines prohibiting it. She shook her head, pulled a stack of papers from her clipboard, and began reading out what sounded like official violations. The problem was that her binder looked more like a scrapbook of random rules she had typed at home than any real HOA document. She insisted that unused storage should remain available for neighborhood overflow. I asked her where in the bylaws it said so. She flipped through her binder, stalling, until finally muttering something about tradition. That was when I realized I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. She genuinely believed my shed belonged to everyone but me. I watched her storm off, muttering about calling an emergency HOA session. My shed wasn't a structure in her eyes, it was a declaration of war. And while I wanted nothing more than to store my lawnmower in peace, I had no idea that padlock would become the first domino in a chain of events that would end with Karen discovering what it feels like to be locked out of her own life. It was just before midnight when the sound woke me. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the siding, the kind of ordinary noise you hear when the wind picks up at night. But the sound didn't stop. It was sharp, metallic, like teeth grinding on steel. I pulled on a sweatshirt and stepped out onto the back porch, only to find a scene that made me wonder if I was dreaming. There was Karen, crouched in her robe and slippers, with a massive pair of bolt cutters clamped around the lock of my shed. Sparks flew as she leaned her full weight into the handles, her face twisted in determination, as though she was breaking into Fort Knox. For a moment, I just stood there in disbelief. Who sneaks into a neighbor's yard at midnight to perform a lock-cutting ceremony? The whole scene looked almost theatrical, like something out of a low-budget heist movie, except the thief was my 50-something neighbor, armed with a tool she probably borrowed from her son's garage. When I finally found my voice and asked her what she thought she was doing, she didn't even look embarrassed. She looked annoyed, as if I was the intruder interrupting her noble mission. She explained in a perfectly calm voice that she was reclaiming what the community had been deprived of. My shed, she insisted, was never meant for one person's private use. According to her, she was doing everyone a favor by removing the lock so that others could store things in it as well. I tried not to laugh, because the conviction in her tone was almost impressive. The way she spoke, you would think she was chairing a board meeting rather than committing trespass in her pajamas. I told her to drop the bolt cutters and go home before I called the police. She tightened her grip on the handles and informed me that I was the one breaking the rules, not her. Then she gave one last violent squeeze, the kind of move that made her slippers skid across the concrete. The lock groaned under the pressure, but it held. That little padlock, the one she hated so much, turned out to be tougher than Karen's midnight determination. At that moment, I realized this wasn't going to stop with one failed attempt. This was just the beginning of a battle she was determined to fight, no matter how ridiculous it looked under the porch light. Don't The morning after her midnight performance, I found a neatly folded packet of papers taped to my front door. The cover page read, "Neighborhood Standards and Compliance," in bold letters, as if it had come straight from a municipal office. The problem was obvious the second I flipped it open. The formatting looked like something a high schooler might have put together in Microsoft Word. Clip art of houses lined the margins. Whole paragraphs had been copied and pasted from unrelated websites, including a section about pool safety despite the fact that no one in the neighborhood had a pool. Still, tucked between the nonsense was the part Karen wanted me to see. She had typed out what she called Article 14, Section B, declaring that all external storage structures must remain accessible to the community at large. She cornered me in the driveway later that day, binder in hand, pointing to that line as though it were scripture. I told her calmly that I had already spoken with the HOA board and that no such article existed. She flipped through her binder, the pages rattling as she searched for backup. Her eyes darted down the page as if she could will more authority into the words she had invented. I asked her who approved this addition to the bylaws. She said the board had voted on it last year, then quickly added that I probably would not have known since I was still new. That was a lie, because I had attended every single meeting since I moved in. And I knew the rules better than she realized. Her voice grew louder, carrying across the street until a few neighbors poked their heads out to see what was happening. She lifted the binder high in the air like it was a holy relic and declared that the shed was a violation of long-standing community tradition. I reminded her that tradition does not equal law and that property lines are not subject to interpretation. For a moment her face froze, and then she snapped the binder shut and stormed off, leaving me standing there with a copy of her homemade legal document. As ridiculous as it was, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. She wasn't improvising. She had gone to the trouble of writing her own rulebook, and that meant she was prepared to keep pushing until she forced everyone else to treat her fantasy as reality. When the police finally arrived, I was half expecting them to laugh the moment they heard the complaint. Karen had called in a report claiming that I was operating an illegal storage facility out of my backyard. She greeted the officer like she was welcoming an old friend, waving her binder of fabricated rules and pointing dramatically toward my shed. The officer, a man who looked like he had dealt with more than his fair share of neighborhood disputes, listened politely while she delivered her speech. She talked about community standards, property values, and the importance of keeping shared spaces open. Her words came out rehearsed, like she had been practicing in front of the mirror. When he turned to me, I simply handed over my paperwork. Title documents, HOA bylaws, and even a letter from the board approving the shed's installation. I kept my voice calm while I explained that everything was permitted and that her claims were completely made up. The officer flipped through the pages, nodding slowly, and then glanced at Karen's binder. I could see the exact moment he realized it wasn't an official document. His eyebrow lifted as he skimmed the clip art and the oddly worded articles. Karen, sensing she was losing ground, raised her voice again. She accused me of trying to trick the neighborhood with fake paperwork. She insisted that she was protecting the community from long-term damage to property values. The officer held up his hand and asked her to point out where, exactly, in the official bylaws, it stated that sheds were communal. She froze. The silence stretched on long enough that the neighbors gathering nearby started whispering to each other. Finally, she muttered that it was understood tradition and that everyone who cared about the community knew it. The officer sighed and handed my papers back. He told her clearly that I was within my rights, that the shed was legal, and that this was not a matter for police involvement. He even suggested she take her concerns to the board rather than wasting emergency services time. Karen's face flushed bright red, and she snapped her binder shut with a loud crack. She stormed off toward her house, muttering about corruption and favoritism. As the patrol car pulled away, I thought the matter might finally be over, but the way she glanced back at me, eyes narrowed and filled with determination, told me this was only the opening skirmish in a battle she had no intention of losing. After the police visit, I decided it was time to protect myself with more than just paperwork. I installed motion cameras around the yard, the kind that sent alerts straight to my phone. 2 nights later, those cameras paid off. I woke to a buzz on my nightstand, rolled over, and saw a live feed of Karen back at my shed. The glow of the infrared made the scene look almost surreal. She was kneeling in front of the lock with the bolt cutters again, muttering under her breath as she tugged and strained against the steel. Every grunt, every scrape of metal echoed through the microphone, captured in crystal clarity. Watching her on my screen, I felt equal parts anger and disbelief. This wasn't a one-time outburst or a passing obsession. She had turned breaking into my property into a mission. Her robe billowed in the night breeze, slippers shuffling against the gravel as she repositioned the cutters for a better angle. She looked like a determined burglar, except instead of a ski mask, she wore hair curlers and a scowl. I stepped quietly onto the porch and called out her name. She froze, eyes darting straight toward the camera above her head. For a second, I thought she might finally realize the absurdity of what she was doing. Instead, she launched into another explanation about how she was liberating the shed for the good of the community. She gestured toward the lock, as if the metal itself was proof of my selfishness. I told her she was on camera and that everything she had just done was recorded. She didn't flinch. She looked directly into the lens and started reciting her argument again, louder this time, as though speaking to an invisible jury. My phone buzzed with the recording, storing every word, every movement. It was evidence no one could twist. Finally, when she realized the lock wasn't budging, she threw the bolt cutters down and marched back to her house. The cameras caught her muttering into her phone, no doubt preparing her next complaint. I replayed the footage twice that night, watching sparks fly from her cutters as the lock held strong. What had once been a tool shed had now become a stage for her late-night theatrics, and with the cameras rolling, she had written herself into a corner she couldn't escape. By the end of that week, the neighborhood had started to notice. It was hard not to when Karen's midnight activities sounded like construction work echoing across the cul-de-sac. People whispered about the clanging metal and the shrill arguments she shouted into the darkness. The cameras gave me proof, but the real shift came when other residents began speaking up. One morning I stepped outside to find my neighbor from 2 doors down standing at the edge of his driveway with a cup of coffee in hand. He shook his head and told me he had been woken 3 nights in a row by the racket. Another neighbor chimed in later that afternoon, explaining how her dog had started barking every time Karen wandered into my yard with tools. Even those who usually stayed quiet about neighborhood drama admitted that they were tired of the late-night disturbances. The community had grown used to her constant complaints, but this was different. This was disruptive in a way that reached into everyone's homes. The real turning point came during a Saturday morning walk. A couple from across the street stopped me and asked what was going on. They had seen Karen hauling the bolt cutters across her yard and muttering about storage violations. Their teenage son had even recorded her from his bedroom window, zooming in as she tried to wrestle with my lock like a burglar. The video spread among the younger residents first, then quietly circulated through the adults until half the block had seen Karen's act. When I checked my mail later that day, I found someone had slipped an anonymous note into my box. It said, "We've dealt with her for years. Don't back down. Everyone is watching." That single sentence told me I was no longer the only one keeping score. Karen's reputation was shifting from bossy neighbor to full-blown spectacle. The late-night cutting, the binder of fake rules, the shouting matches with police officers, all of it was building a picture that even her longtime allies couldn't defend. As the whispers grew louder, I realized her biggest mistake wasn't attacking my shed. It was doing it so openly and so often that the entire neighborhood had become unwilling witnesses. For once, the spotlight she craved was turning against her. The morning after the neighborhood began murmuring about her late-night raids, I discovered something new taped across my front door. It looked official at first glance, printed on thick paper with a crest at the top that resembled a city emblem. The words, "Neighborhood Violation Notice," were stamped in bold across the header. For a split second, I almost believed it was real, until I noticed the emblem was actually a blurry clip art image of an eagle. The violation list included phrases so ridiculous I had to laugh, like hoarding unauthorized tools and creating unsanctioned storage monopolies. I peeled the notice off and found 3 more scattered around the property. One was attached to my mailbox, another tucked under my windshield wiper, and the last taped directly to the shed door she hated so much. Each one carried a fine amount written in red marker, the numbers getting larger with each posting. $200, then $300, then $500. It was as though she had created her own economic system overnight, with herself as the tax collector. Later that afternoon, I caught her in the act. She was crouched by my driveway with a stack of these notices in her lap, carefully laminating them with sheets of plastic to keep them from being ruined by rain. She looked up, startled for only a second, then smiled, as if she were handing out helpful flyers. She explained that she had taken it upon herself to create a more efficient system of accountability since the HOA board had been too lenient. I told her flat out that none of this was valid. Her handwriting was even visible in the fine print at the bottom, where she had signed each notice as Neighborhood Compliance Director. She straightened her shoulders and said the position was newly created by community demand, though no one else had ever heard of it. When I asked who had voted her in, she muttered something about silent approval and quickly taped another notice to the fence post. By evening, I had a small stack of fake citations sitting on my kitchen counter. They might have been laughable if not for the sheer persistence behind them. It was clear she wasn't trying to follow rules anymore. She was inventing them out of thin air and daring me to challenge her authority. I finally decided that if Karen was going to keep waving papers around, I would bring in real ones of my own. I called a licensed surveyor and arranged for an official property line inspection. A week later, a truck pulled up with measuring equipment and bright orange flags. The surveyor spent hours walking the yard, double-checking the original plats, and confirming the exact layout of my lot. I stayed nearby, watching him mark the ground with chalk and stakes, careful not to miss a single detail. When he finished, the truth was laid out in neon orange across the grass. My shed was exactly where it belonged, well within my boundary lines, and completely legal. What made me laugh was the discovery that came next. Karen's pristine white fence, the one she had bragged about for years at every HOA meeting, was actually planted several feet onto my property. The surveyor showed me the measurements, pointing out where her posts crossed the line and where her flower bed crept into my yard. It was not a small mistake either. Nearly a quarter of her side yard technically belonged to me. When I confronted her with the findings, she folded her arms and refused to look at the flags. She claimed the survey was invalid, that my surveyor was biased, and that her fence had been there forever. I reminded her that time doesn't rewrite legal boundaries. She ignored the orange flags altogether, stepping over them as if they didn't exist, and told me I would regret challenging her. Neighbors started asking questions as soon as they saw the stakes in the ground. A few wandered over, curious about the sudden activity. When I explained, they raised their eyebrows, some even chuckled, because the irony was impossible to ignore. The same woman who had been screaming about my shed for weeks was guilty of a much bigger encroachment. That night, as I looked out the window at the glowing markers scattered across the yard, I realized I finally had something more powerful than her binder or her fake citations. I had proof that not only was my shed completely legitimate, but Karen had been trespassing on my land for years. It wasn't just embarrassing for her, it was leverage. And for the first time since this ridiculous feud began, I felt like the ground literally was on my side. After the surveyor left and the neighbors had their quiet laughs, I knew Karen wasn't going to stop. The bolt cutter incident and the fake citations proved she would keep coming until she found a way to declare victory. So, I decided it was time to reinforce my defenses. The simple padlock on the shed had already survived her attacks, but I wanted something that would send a message. I went out and bought a heavy industrial chain lock, the kind used on construction sites to secure equipment overnight. Thick links of steel looped through the handles, secured with a lock that weighed more than her entire clipboard. When I snapped it into place, the sound echoed like a closing vault door. That evening, I caught her standing at the edge of her yard, staring at it. Her expression was priceless. Where before she had only needed bolt cutters, now she was looking at a fortress. She crossed her arms, shook her head, and called out across the fence that I was escalating hostilities. I nearly laughed at the phrase, because she made it sound like we were two rival nations on the brink of war. I reminded her calmly that all I had done was secure my own property, which should not have been controversial. Later that night, my cameras picked her up again, but this time she didn't approach the shed. She circled around the yard, peering at the new chain like it was an unsolvable puzzle. She tugged at it once, then muttered something to herself and stormed off. The footage captured her frustration perfectly. Neighbors began commenting on the new lock the next day. One joked that it looked like I was protecting treasure. Another said it was about time someone stood up to Karen's constant meddling. Their support made me realize that every step I took to protect myself also exposed how unreasonable she had become. Karen, of course, didn't see it that way. To her, the new lock was an insult, proof that I was defying her imagined authority. She started pacing in front of her window, binder clutched to her chest, watching me with narrowed eyes. That chain didn't just protect my shed, It provoked her, and I could tell she was already scheming her next move. The new chain lock didn't just frustrate Karen, it drove her to try something even more desperate. A few days later, I got a phone call from a locksmith in town, who sounded both puzzled and uneasy. He explained that a woman had come into his shop, insisting she needed a key made for the lock on my shed. She described it in detail, even pulled out a blurry photo printed from her phone, and told him she was the rightful owner who had lost access. The locksmith had been in the business long enough to know when something didn't feel right, so he decided to look me up before cutting a key. When I confirmed that the shed belonged to me and that no one else had permission to enter it, his voice tightened. He told me she had given him my name but claimed I was her tenant, and that she had every right to override my lock. Hearing it spelled out like that, the audacity was almost unbelievable. She had walked into a professional's shop and tried to spin a story convincing enough to get tools made for breaking into my property. The locksmith said he stalled her by pretending the machines were tied up and asked her to return later. She left in a hurry, muttering about incompetence, leaving behind the photo she had printed. He offered to hand it over to me, saying he didn't want to be caught in the middle of a feud, but also didn't want to be responsible for enabling something illegal. That evening, I drove down and picked it up. The grainy picture showed my shed under the glow of a streetlight, the chain lock glinting in the center. It looked like evidence pulled from a detective file, except the person gathering it was the very neighbor trying to break in. Holding the photo in my hands, I felt both anger and relief. Anger that she had gone so far, and relief that someone honest had caught her attempt before she could act on it. When I returned home, I installed another camera aimed directly at the shed door. If she was bold enough to involve a locksmith, it was only a matter of time before she tried something worse, and this time, I wanted every angle covered. It happened on a bright afternoon when I thought the worst of her antics had passed. I was mowing the lawn, headphones in, when I noticed movement near the shed. By the time I pulled the earbuds out, Karen was already inside, the door wide open, her hands on my belongings, as though she had every right to be there. She had waited for a moment when I was distracted, slipped across the property line, and decided that today was the day she would enforce her so-called community rights. She began dragging items out one by one, stacking them neatly on the curb like she was conducting an eviction. My lawnmower, my hedge trimmer, even the boxes of gardening supplies I kept for spring planting were hauled out and lined up as if they were evidence in a crime scene. I shouted her name and ran over, but she barely flinched. She told me calmly that the shed was being repurposed for neighborhood use and that I would need to find alternative storage arrangements. I stood there dumbfounded as she explained that other residents had expressed interest in having a communal tool library and that she had taken the initiative to make it happen. I told her flatly that no such agreement had ever been discussed, let alone approved. She waved me off, saying that progress often required bold action. Her bold action, in this case, was tossing my property onto the grass without permission. When I tried to step inside to stop her, she blocked the doorway and accused me of interfering with her duties. My phone was already recording in my pocket, capturing every word as she insisted that I had forfeited my rights by locking the shed. She even held up one of my rakes and announced that it would soon be available for the entire block. I called out to a neighbor across the street who had been watching in stunned silence. The moment he walked over, camera phone in hand, Karen's confidence faltered. She muttered something about misunderstandings and hurried back toward her house, leaving my things scattered across the lawn. I gathered everything up slowly, making sure the camera caught the mess she had left behind. That afternoon made it clear she was no longer just playing at authority. She was willing to cross any line, even if it meant breaking into my shed in broad daylight. The next HOA meeting was already tense before I even walked into the community center. Word of Karen's latest stunt had spread quickly, and half the neighborhood was buzzing about the shed raid. She arrived early, binder tucked under her arm, and had already set up a small display of photos she had taken of my property. Each one was printed on glossy paper and taped to poster boards, complete with captions about alleged violations. When I entered the room, she gave me a look of triumph, as if this was the day she would finally win. The meeting began with routine updates about landscaping contracts and budget allocations, but Karen wasted no time in interrupting. She stood up, cleared her throat loudly, and demanded that her complaint be heard first. With dramatic flair, she held up one of her posters showing my shed at night, the chain lock gleaming under the streetlight. She declared that this was proof of unsanctioned private storage, and insisted the board issue me a fine. The room went quiet for a moment, and then one of the board members asked her to point to the bylaw she was referencing. She flipped through her binder, muttering about sections and articles, until it became obvious that nothing she held was legitimate. Another board member reminded her that the shed had already been reviewed and approved months ago, and that no new complaints had been filed through the proper channels. Karen's face turned red as she tried to argue that tradition outweighed paperwork, but by then, a few neighbors had started chuckling under their breath. One resident even raised his hand and asked if Karen planned to fine herself for building her fence several feet over the property line. That comment sent ripples of laughter through the room, and Karen's composure cracked. She slammed her binder shut, declaring that the board was corrupt and that no one cared about community values. The president of the HOA calmly told her that if she continued disrupting meetings with fabricated evidence, she could be formally reprimanded. I sat back quietly, letting the board handle her unraveling. For once, the weight wasn't on me to prove my innocence. Her obsession was speaking louder than anything I could say. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone present that Karen had turned the shed into her personal crusade, and no one was buying it anymore. After the chaos of the meeting, I realized there was no reasoning with her. The board had dismissed her fabricated rules, the neighbors had laughed at her binder, and yet she still left the room muttering about conspiracies and favoritism. It became obvious that waiting for her to give up was a mistake. If anything, every failure only fueled her determination to escalate. That was when the idea struck me. If she was so obsessed with locks, maybe it was time to let her taste what it felt like to live surrounded by them. I began planning quietly, taking careful steps so nothing could be twisted into another one of her wild accusations. The evidence I had collected from my cameras gave me leverage, but I wanted more than just proof. I wanted a solution that would end the constant harassment. The answer came in the form of code enforcement. After consulting with a city inspector about her fence encroachment and her repeated trespassing, I learned there were legitimate grounds to file a complaint. The process was slow, but once started, it had the potential to change everything. While I handled the paperwork, I also thought about the symbolism. She had mocked my padlocks and tried to tear them away. What if the very thing she despised most became the defining feature of her own property? The thought made me smile for the first time in weeks. Instead of playing defense, I would take the fight directly to her, but with the law on my side. The more I imagined it, the clearer the plan became. We would secure every entry point of her home, legally, through the enforcement orders she had practically begged the city to investigate with her constant meddling. She wanted control, but she was about to discover what it felt like to lose it completely. I kept my intentions quiet, even from sympathetic neighbors, because I knew the element of surprise mattered. Karen thrived on attention. She expected arguments, shouting matches, and dramatic confrontations. What she would not expect was silence, followed by a sudden, immovable barrier. By the end of that week, I had gathered every document, every recording, and every piece of evidence I needed. For the first time since this battle began, I felt calm. Karen believed she was writing the rules, but I was preparing to lock her story shut for good. The plan moved from idea to action the day I met with a locksmith who had worked with the city before. He understood immediately what I wanted and why. I laid out the stack of evidence I had collected, from video clips of her trespassing to the survey showing her fence encroachment. He shook his head slowly and told me he had seen plenty of messy neighbor disputes, but this one had a special kind of determination behind it. When I explained that the city was preparing to act on the code violations, he leaned back in his chair and said it could be done. We started with her front gate. It was already flagged for improper placement by the inspector, which meant it could be sealed until compliance was verified. The locksmith replaced her flimsy latch with a heavy master lock, one that clicked shut with finality. Her driveway followed, fitted with a chain and lock that made it impossible to pull a car in or out. Each step was documented with photographs and official tags from the enforcement office, so that nothing could be mistaken for personal retaliation. The real shock, however, came when we rekeyed her house. Using the city's authorization, the locksmith installed new locks that only officials could open until the violations were addressed. It was perfectly legal, a temporary measure to 219 Con, ensure no one could continue using property built over another's land. For once, the rules she loved to invent had turned against her. I stood across the street watching her reaction when she arrived home that evening. She walked up confidently, binder in hand, and tugged at the gate. The chain rattled, but it did not move. She tried the door next, jiggling the handle with growing frustration, before realizing the key she carried no longer worked. Her voice rose as she shouted accusations into the empty air, demanding to know who had tampered with her home. A few neighbors lingered at their windows, quietly observing the scene she was creating for herself. In that moment, I did not gloat or shout back. I simply recorded her bewildered expression as she discovered what it meant to be locked out by forces she could not control. For the first time, Karen was the one on the outside looking in. The following morning brought the first wave of phone calls. Karen had apparently woken up to find her driveway blocked off by a set of bright yellow barriers installed by the city's code enforcement team. A heavy chain ran through the posts, secured with a lock as thick as my wrist. It was the kind of setup used for construction sites, not suburban homes, and it sent a clear message. Until her violations were addressed, she wasn't going anywhere. When I stepped outside to grab the paper, I saw her pacing in circles in her front yard. She tugged at the chain once, then twice, before realizing it was far beyond her strength to break. Her car sat trapped behind the barrier, nose pressed against the metal like a caged animal. The frustration on her face was almost theatrical. She shouted across the street, accusing me of conspiring with the city to ruin her life. I didn't bother answering. The tags on the barriers clearly showed it was an official action, not a personal prank. Neighbors drifted out of their houses one by one, drawn by the commotion. A few whispered to each other, trying not to laugh, while others stood openly in their driveways, enjoying the spectacle. Karen stomped over to the nearest group and began her usual speech about defending community rights, waving her binder around like a shield. This time, though, no one nodded in agreement. A woman from the corner house actually asked her why she had been cutting locks off other people's property in the first place. Karen's face turned crimson, and she stormed back toward her chained driveway, binder clutched against her chest. The rest of the day played out like a slow unraveling. Delivery trucks drove past without stopping because they couldn't access her garage. Friends she had invited over turned around in confusion when they saw the barricades. Every inconvenience piled onto her mounting fury, and every outburst added another layer of entertainment for the neighbors. I watched from my porch in silence, sipping coffee while my cameras recorded her pacing, shouting, and finally collapsing onto the front steps in defeat. For once, I didn't need to lift a finger. The chain across her driveway spoke louder than anything I could have said. She had spent weeks trying to cut locks from my shed, and now she was the one locked in place, trapped by rules she could no longer bend. The driveway barrier was only the beginning. Within days, additional enforcement notices arrived, each one targeting another part of Karen's property. The first involved her electrical box. Inspectors had flagged it for being modified without a permit, which meant it could be sealed until the work was corrected. When the enforcement officer clipped a lock onto the panel and tagged it with a bright red warning, Karen nearly fainted in the yard. She shouted that her rights were being violated, but the officer calmly explained that tampering with city equipment could lead to fines and even criminal charges. The sprinkler system came next. For years she had bragged about her elaborate underground irrigation, claiming it was the reason her lawn looked like a golf course. The inspectors, however, found she had tapped into a restricted water line without approval. That discovery led to another lock, this time on the control box, leaving her grass to fend for itself in the summer heat. Watching her stand helplessly with a garden hose while her once flawless yard began to yellow was almost surreal. Every new lock seemed to take a piece of her authority away. She had spent so long positioning herself as the enforcer of the neighborhood that seeing her own property sealed shut turned her into a parody of the role she had invented. Neighbors gathered quietly to observe whenever another lock appeared, shaking their heads or whispering jokes about her sudden fall from power. Karen reacted by doubling down on her binder, adding pages of handwritten complaints and demanding emergency meetings. No one showed up to her gatherings anymore. She held court alone at her picnic table, binder open, speaking to empty chairs as if the audience she once commanded still sat there nodding along. For me, it was the first time in months that I felt genuine relief. The shed sat untouched, my tools safe, while Karen's empire crumbled under the weight of real regulations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She had declared herself the guardian of community order, only to find her own house wrapped in locks and warning tags. The more she fought, the tighter those locks seemed to hold, until her once perfect property looked more like a construction site under quarantine. It did not take long before the entire situation spilled onto social media. The first clip came from a teenager down the street who had filmed Karen rattling the chain on her driveway gate. She was shouting about conspiracies and waving her binder like it was a sword, while her car sat uselessly behind the barrier. The video was posted to a neighborhood group, and within hours it spread far, beyond our block. People started commenting with nicknames, the most popular being Storage Karen. Soon more clips followed. Someone recorded her yelling at the code enforcement officer when he padlocked her sprinkler box. Another neighbor captured her pacing in front of her locked electrical panel, shouting at the tag as though it could hear her. Each video was funnier than the last, but also more embarrassing for her, because she never realized how absurd she looked until the whole world was watching. Memes appeared almost overnight. One showed her binder photoshopped into a medieval shield. Another turned the padlock on her driveway into a superhero emblem. The comment sections filled with people swapping stories of their own difficult neighbors, and Karen's face became the universal image of overstepping authority. What surprised me most was the sudden shift in the neighborhood. People who had once stayed quiet now openly laughed about her antics. At the mailbox, one resident told me he had watched her live on Facebook, ranting about a neighborhood conspiracy, only for the comments to fill with strangers making jokes about her situation. The more she posted, the more material she gave them, and the more the mockery grew. Karen's obsession with controlling everyone had finally turned against her. She wanted to be seen as the protector of community values, but now she was trending as the woman who lost a battle with her neighbor's shed and ended up locked inside her own property. I watched her from my porch one evening as she screamed into her phone, pacing in circles while notifications lit up the screen. She thought she was rallying support, but in reality, she had become a spectacle. The locks had stripped away her power, and the internet had finished the job by making her a punchline. The police were bound to be dragged back into it, and sure enough, Karen made the call one evening just as the sun was setting. I saw the patrol car pull into the cul-de-sac and knew immediately who had dialed. Karen stormed out of her house before the officer even stepped onto the pavement, shouting that she was being unlawfully imprisoned in her own home. She pointed at the chain across her driveway and the locks on her utility boxes as if they were evidence of a kidnapping plot. The officer listened patiently, arms crossed, while she ranted about conspiracies and neighborhood harassment. She claimed she could not leave her property, that she was trapped against her will, and that someone needed to be arrested. Her performance was dramatic enough to draw a small crowd of neighbors who came outside to see the latest spectacle. When the officer turned to me for my side, I simply handed him the folder of documents from code enforcement. Every lock and every barrier had an official order attached to it. He flipped through the papers, reading the stamped approvals and violation reports, before nodding in understanding. He asked Karen if she had corrected any of the issues listed. She sputtered, saying that the rules were unfair and that she should not have to follow them. The officer's response was calm but firm. He explained that what she was experiencing was not imprisonment, but the consequence of failing to comply with regulations she had ignored. He pointed out the tags on the locks and reminded her that tampering with them would lead to criminal charges. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. She stood there with her mouth opening and closing, binder clutched tightly against her chest, while the neighbors exchanged amused glances. As the officer prepared to leave, Karen tried one last time to spin the story, asking if he could at least cite me for harassment. He shook his head, reminding her that all the actions were taken by city officials, not me. The look on her face was one of pure disbelief. She had called for backup, expecting the law to side with her, and instead the law had reminded her that she was the cried problem. The patrol car pulled away, leaving her alone in the driveway, rattling the chain that held her car hostage. The fallout from her police call rippled straight into the next HOA meeting. By now, the board members had seen the videos and read the reports, so the air was thick with anticipation when Karen marched in with her binder. She looked determined, convinced she would win sympathy, but the expressions around the table told a different story. People were tired of the noise, the fake rules, and the constant circus that followed her. She opened the meeting by slamming her binder onto the table and demanding that the community rally behind her. She claimed she was the victim of targeted harassment, pointing at me as though I were the villain orchestrating her downfall. Her speech rambled from storage violations to neighborhood safety to an alleged conspiracy between code enforcement and myself. The board let her speak, but the silence in the room grew heavier with every sentence. When she finished, the HOA president cleared his throat and asked a simple question. What proof did she have that any of her claims were true? Karen flipped through her binder, holding up photos of my shed, copies of her fabricated notices, and handwritten pages of so-called violations. The president glanced at them, then set them aside, reminding her that none of those documents were official and that the board had already approved the shed months earlier. At that moment, one of the longtime residents stood up and said what everyone else had been thinking. He pointed out that Karen's fence was still over the property line and that her driveway had been declared illegal. He added that her actions had dragged the neighborhood into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. A few others nodded, and suddenly the room was buzzing with agreement. The president called for a vote, something I hadn't expected. The motion was simple: suspend Karen from her role as HOA president until her violations were resolved. Hands shot up around the table, one after another, until the majority was undeniable. Karen's face drained of color as the verdict was announced. She tried to protest, shouting that the board was corrupt, but the gavel came down firmly, silencing her. For years, she had used the HOA as her weapon. In one short meeting, that weapon was taken away. The neighbors filed out quietly, some exchanging small smiles, while Karen sat frozen in her chair, binder pressed to her lap, realizing that the authority she clung to had finally slipped from her grasp. When Karen lost her HOA title, her next move was to hire a lawyer. It did not take long before I saw a man in a press suit step out of her front door, clutching a briefcase and looking like he had just walked into a storm. She must have told him her version of events, because a few days later I received a formal letter demanding that I remove the shed, lift the locks, and pay her damages for emotional distress. The letter was written in stiff legal language, but the accusations were as wild as her binder. She claimed I had orchestrated a campaign to humiliate her, and that the shed was the root of a conspiracy to ruin her reputation. I contacted my own attorney, who laughed after reading it. He explained that no case built on fabrications would stand in court, especially when we had hours of video evidence showing her cutting at locks and dragging my belongings out of the shed. He advised me to let her lawyer waste his time and money. Still, I was curious to see how far she would push. The answer came sooner than I expected. Her lawyer filed paperwork for a hearing, but just 2 days before the date, he withdrew from the case. The official reason listed was conflict of interest, but word spread quickly that he had discovered she had hidden key details, like the video footage and the code enforcement orders. No attorney wants to walk into a courtroom with a client who has already destroyed their own credibility. Karen reacted by telling anyone who would listen that the lawyer had betrayed her, that he was secretly in league with me, and that she would find someone stronger to take her case. But the truth was obvious. No professional wanted to attach their name to her spiral. Even her closest allies in the neighborhood started stepping back, unwilling to be dragged into her drama now that it had reached the legal system. When I checked my cameras that evening, I saw her sitting on her porch with the binder open, scribbling furiously into the margins as if she could write herself a new defense. The glow from her porch light cast a weary shadow across her face. For the first time, she looked less like the enforcer of the neighborhood and more like someone realizing her arsenal of excuses had finally run dry. The courtroom felt colder than I expected when the day of the hearing arrived. Karen came in clutching her infamous binder, paper spilling from the sides like feathers from a worn pillow. She walked with the confidence of someone who believed her speech alone could change reality. When the judge called the case, she launched straight into her argument, declaring that my shed was an illegal structure, that the locks around her house were part of a personal vendetta, and that she was the true defender of the neighborhood. Her voice echoed across the room, shrill and unwavering, as if volume could make up for a lack of evidence. The judge listened patiently at first, but it didn't take long for the skepticism to show. He leaned back, eyebrows raised, asking her to point out which bylaw supported her claims. Karen opened her binder, flipping through page after page, until she finally settled on her homemade Article 14, Section B. She read it aloud with theatrical emphasis. The silence that followed was almost comical. The judge blinked once, then asked her who had written that section. She stammered something about community tradition and implied consent. His response was swift. Tradition was not law. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. I handed over the official HOA documents, the property survey, and the enforcement records. I also provided the footage of Karen cutting at my locks, along with still images of the fake violation notices she had laminated and taped around my property. The judge studied each piece, nodding slowly, while Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The moment that broke her composure came when the judge asked if she was aware her own fence extended several feet onto my property. The courtroom rustled with whispers as her face flushed crimson. She tried to deflect, claiming it was irrelevant, but the judge cut her off, reminding her that property law applied equally to everyone. By the end, his ruling was clear. My shed was lawful. Her complaints had no merit, and the so-called evidence she had presented carried no legal weight. Karen stood frozen as the words sank in, binder clutched tightly to her chest, while the rest of us heard the unmistakable sound of her imagined authority collapsing in real time. When the judge delivered his final decision, it felt like the weight of the past months finally shifted off my shoulders. He signed the order, approving every measure taken by code enforcement, and declared that additional restrictions would remain in place until all her violations were resolved. In plain terms, that meant the locks on her property were not temporary inconveniences. They were official, court-backed barriers that would stay exactly where they were until she paid fines, corrected her fence, and cleared the list of infractions she had ignored. The words landed like a hammer. Karen had gone into the hearing, expecting vindication. Instead, she walked out with her house under what could only be described as permanent lockdown. The atmosphere in the courtroom was unforgettable. Neighbors who had come to watch sat quietly at beaded first, and then a ripple of relieved laughter spread as the judge's ruling became clear. Some covered their mouths to hide their grins, but most could not resist the satisfaction of seeing the enforcer of imaginary rules finally face real ones. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she had been struck. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to protest, but no words came out. She clutched her binder against her chest like it was a life raft that had suddenly sprung a leak. Outside the courthouse, she attempted to rally sympathy by telling anyone who would listen that the system was corrupt. But her audience had thinned. The same neighbors who once nodded along to her speeches now avoided eye contact. Even the friends she had bragged about calling for support slipped away without comment. The court's ruling had stripped her not just of authority, but of credibility. Back on our street, the changes were immediate. The locks on her driveway and utility boxes remained in place with bright enforcement tags that now carried the authority of the court. Every time she rattled the chains or tugged at the barriers, she was reminded that her house had become the very symbol of the rules she had tried to force on others. The irony was impossible to ignore. For months, she demanded compliance from everyone else. Now, she lived inside a fortress of her own making, locked down until she obeyed the same laws she had pretended to uphold. The weekend after the court ruling, the neighborhood felt lighter, almost celebratory. For the first time in months, people gathered without worrying about being interrupted by Karen's accusations or her binder of rules. Someone suggested a community cookout, and within a few hours grills were rolling out, tables were lined with food, and lawn chairs dotted the street. The air smelled of barbecue and fresh-cut grass, laughter echoing from driveways that had been quiet for far too long. What made the event memorable was the view from across the street. Karen's house stood silent, its driveway still chained, her utilities locked, and bright tags fluttering in the breeze like warning flags. She watched from her window, blinds cracked just enough to reveal the outline of her face. Every so often she would vanish, only to reappear a few minutes later with her phone pressed to her ear, clearly calling anyone who might still listen. Nobody came. The children ran through sprinklers, neighbors traded stories, and a speaker played music just loud enough to carry across the cul-de-sac. At one point, someone raised a toast with a plastic cup of lemonade and joked that the celebration should be called Freedom from Storage Night. Everyone laughed, and the sound carried straight to her locked front yard. For once, the community she claimed to protect was united, but not because of her leadership. They were united in relief that her reign of endless complaints had been cut short. I sat on my porch, plate in hand, watching the gathering unfold. People I had barely spoken to before came over to thank me for standing my ground. They said my patience and persistence had forced the truth into the open. I told them it was not just me, but the collective refusal to keep playing along with her fantasies. The cookout had the atmosphere of a neighborhood reclaiming itself. A quiet rebellion turned into a party. As the sun set, the glow from the grills faded into strings of patio lights. Karen remained inside, blinds twitching now and then, but she never stepped out. Her silence said more than her binder ever had. The neighborhood had moved on without her, and for the first time in a long while, the street felt like home again. It did not take long before the story left the confines of our street. A local news crew showed up one morning, cameras rolling as they interviewed neighbors about the strange situation. The headline on the evening broadcast read, "Woman locks neighbor's shed, gets her own house. Locked instead." The segment opened with drone footage of our cul-de-sac, the camera zooming in on the chain stretched across Karen's driveway. Clips from the viral videos were spliced together, showing her tugging at the locks, shouting about conspiracies, and brandishing her binder like it was a legal weapon. The reporter stood in front of my shed, explaining how a private storage dispute spiraled into a full neighborhood drama. They interviewed the neighbor who caught her on camera with bolt cutters and another resident who admitted she had once been too intimidated to speak up. Now that Karen's behavior had gone public, they said, the entire community felt freer. Their words painted her less as a defender of order and more as a cautionary tale of what happens when control turns into obsession. Karen, of course, refused to comment on camera. She stood in her window during the filming, phone pressed to her ear, glaring at the crew as though they were trespassers. When the segment aired, her face was blurred at first, but once the online versions began circulating, the original, unedited clips from neighbors filled in the details. Within a week, the news report had been shared thousands of times on social platforms. Comment sections filled with jokes about shed wars and karma, and people from other states chimed in with stories of their own difficult neighbors. The funniest part was how the story was framed. The news didn't treat it like a bitter property dispute. They treated it like an absurd comedy of errors. The anchor ended the segment by saying, "Sometimes the locks you cut end up on your own door." That line replayed in my head for days. It summed up everything perfectly. Walking down the street after the report aired felt different. Strangers who had seen the clip waved when they recognized me, and neighbors joked about scheduling interviews of their own. Karen's binder had once been the loudest voice in the neighborhood. Now, it was drowned out by a story that belonged to everyone, told and retold, until it no longer felt like a battle, but a punchline delivered on the evening news. Karen had always spoken about security as if it were her personal mission. She used to stand at meetings and warn that without her vigilance, the neighborhood would fall apart. She claimed she was the only one willing to enforce order, the one person brave enough to lock down trouble before it spread. That was the irony that made the ending so fitting. After all her speeches, all her fake citations, all her late-night raids on my shed, she ended up living in the most secure house in the entire community. The locks were not symbolic anymore. They were real, heavy, and unyielding. Her driveway was sealed, her utilities were tagged, her gate rattled each time the wind blew, reminding her of the restrictions she had brought on herself. Neighbors passed by on their walks, glancing at the chains and shaking their heads. Some smiled, others whispered, but none offered sympathy. The same woman who had tried to trap others with invented rules was now literally trapped by actual ones. Every time I looked across the street, I saw her curtains twitch. She rarely stepped outside anymore. When she did, it was only to tug once more at the locked barriers, or to glare at the cameras that had caught her so many times before. The binder, once her badge of authority, now sat forgotten on her porch, pages curling in the sun, ignored even by her. What struck me most was how quiet things had become. The street that once echoed with her shouts now carried the sound of kids playing, dogs barking, and neighbors chatting without fear of interruption. Life moved forward, and she became a silent figure inside a house that looked more like a cautionary display than a home. For me, the shed stood untouched, my tools exactly where I left them. The chain lock gleamed in the light, not from her bolt cutters but from my care. It was more than storage, and now, it was proof that sometimes the smallest stand against someone unreasonable can topple the loudest bully. Karen wanted control, and in chasing it, she secured herself more tightly than she ever intended. In the end, her house became the fortress she always demanded for others, only this time she was the one locked inside. And there you have it, the saga of Karen who cut my locks and ended up locked down herself. Proof that sometimes karma doesn't just knock it, padlocks the door, chains the driveway, and tosses away the key. If you've made it this far, you're officially stronger than my shed padlock. Smash that subscribe button for more stories where Karens write their own downfall. Drop a comment with your wildest neighbor drama, and remember, Audacity may be free, but consequences? Those come with reinforced steel. Until next time, may your locks hold strong and your neighbors mind their own storage.